Welcome to Cut to the Crypto, brought to you by Unstoppable Domains. I'm Tony Karen Brown, and I'm your host. This is your 15 minutes of crypto, asked and answered. Hi, today I am joined by Zoe Scammon. Zoe, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's also nice to have a fellow English accent. It's not all the time I get to hear that anymore in American. So you, Zoe, are the founder of Bodacious, which you have described as a strategy studio that embraces variety, creativity, and complexity, which I absolutely love. But what really caught my eye was, I think, your desire, but potentially also your mission to focus on the rapidly emerging shifts that we're seeing in entertainment and fandom. And that captured my eye because we've been talking a lot about fandom and Web3 on this podcast. But we're not going to be talking about that today. We're going to be talking about education, which is a slightly different space. But you also, which I also loved, you described yourself as a Swiss Army knife, which I absolutely love and I can very much relate to. And you described this because you're a multifaceted human being with all of these different experiences and expertise, but also because you've worked in so many different places, such as Sydney and London and New York and even Ethiopia. So maybe before we dive into the education space, how did you land in the world of crypto and Web3? How did that happen?
I think I've always been drawn to the new shiny stuff. That's a bit of a pattern throughout my career. And I've always described myself as a bit of a magpie. So whenever something sort of new and interesting pops up, I'm always one of the first to kind of go down that rabbit hole and explore it for a little bit and then figure out whether or not that has any bearing on my work and my career and potentially where I want to go to next. And where I was prior to going sort of fully fledged into Bodacious was with Ridley Scott, the film director. And my remit there was, what is the future of entertainment? Where is it going to go? So I spent a lot of time investigating, immersive gaming worlds and looking at the future of intellectual property within Hollywood. And, obviously cryptocurrencies and the future of fandom started coming up. And so when I left there and went into Bodacious and said, right, that's where I kind of want to be next, I just went deeper into those rabbit holes. Obviously, everything accelerated because of the pandemic and because of COVID, and lots of people sat at home twiddling their thumbs, are very, very bored, and it all just exploded. So I think it was kind of right place, right time.
Did you see any parallels as we did? We're going to promise we're going to dig into education, but there's an interesting thing here based on what you just said. Are there any parallels between what you saw with entertainment and education in a pre-post pandemic world? Are people looking at it in the same way?
I think the main parallels that I would draw is this idea of shifting from centralized control and, big corporations basically dictating the terms and the status quo and the way things are done, moving more towards not necessarily full decentralization, because I'm not so much of an evangelist that I think that's ever going to really happen, because we live in a capitalist society. It is what it is. But I think this idea of the democratization of the ability to access content in a very similar way that you can access education, in the ability for you to, if you're a professor, for example, to be able to actually make and distribute content and cultivate a group of students, very similar to entertainment, where you can create content, build an audience, cultivate that community for yourself. So I think that generally it's the move from these big hierarchical corporate structures into more of a pockets of innovation and culture and interesting stuff, and just people being able to create whatever it is they want to create and put it out there.
I love that. And to add a little bit of context in terms of education, as a European education, especially in America, and I think very similarly to healthcare, is both a space and an industry that many have tried to rethink and reshape over the years. And I think many have tried, many have failed. Some aspects have been able to be shifted over the years. And I think most of us would agree that it's absolutely an industry rife with innovation, both from a student perspective and maybe from an employee perspective. So education at the start of it, but also the reskilling and the upskilling of your employees. And it's actually pretty crazy to think about how little that space has remained unchanged. Most of those education systems have stayed the same, even though the technology has advanced. The tools and the skills that we need today were not the same as those that we needed, a handful of years, even just a handful of years ago. And you recently wrote an incredibly, I thought, poignant piece about education in 2032, which I would love to talk a little bit about. And you mentioned things like super apps and immersive educational experiences and live learning and the eduverse and even community knowledge sharing, which you just brought up just now. And all of these ideas and categories seem even more possible today in a post pandemic world, in a post COVID-19 world. And so I guess my question to you today, Zoe, is truly, what does Web3 mean for the future of education? What are you seeing and what are you excited about?
I think for me, the way that I normally think about Web3 is it's the next iteration of the internet from an infrastructure perspective in terms of where we're going to be going to next. I think about Web1 was information links in terms of, being able to find content on the internet. So that was, google.com and
Mm,
Yahoo and AOL and that kind of stuff. And then we went into Web2, which is all about social links. So, your Facebooks, your MySpaces, those kind of things. And where we're going to now is economic links. So that's the way that I normally think about Web3. And the economic links, the way that I think about it is, we create a huge amount of value on the internet on a daily basis, but the people who realize that value are few and far between because they are in these kind of, corporate structures. So the
yeah.
Zuckerbergs of the world are realizing a huge amount of value. Whereas people like you and me, we are creating content on a regular basis on the internet, such as when we post Instagram post or
Mm,
tweets or something along those lines, but we don't realize that value directly. So I think with the advent of blockchain, with the advent of tokenization, NFTs, whatever you want to have a look at it as, it is starting to shift the dynamic in terms of the value creation versus value realization. And I think the
mm,
same kind of thing is potentially going to be happening for the education space as well. And as you mentioned, especially in the US, it is an industry. So Harvard, and those colleges of that ilk are gigantic brands, in their own right.
mm,
They harvest a huge amount of money from their students. Basically, the students are desperately trying to get in so they can earn the brand Harvard on their CV, which then opens up doors that won't necessarily open up for other people. And as a result of being able to create that, Yale, for example, we see it as a fashion staple, actually having, the kind of Yale, badges on our sweatshirts, all of that kind of stuff as
yeah.
well. And it has become exclusive and it's become expensive. And so it's shut off to a huge portion of people. But if we start to actually take that idea of the democratization of content creation and the democratization of content access, as is happening, in the wider space that we're seeing in, Web 2 and then kind of Web 2.5, if we look at that for education, suddenly that decreases the power of these big archaic brands in the education space. It increases the ability for everyday people to access the kind of content and education that, the upper echelons have had.
Yeah.
And it starts to actually say, well, shouldn't this be open to everybody? As opposed to the people that have come up in blue blood families or they've got millions in their bank accounts, they can buy their way into these institutions. And so it starts to slightly disrupt the status quo in terms of
Mm,
how the education system first of all is built from the age of 0 to 11, and then 11 through your high school years, and then you go off to your colleges, then your colleges spit you into the big firms, and that is the way that it always is.
yeah.
And it just means that inequality grows. But actually, if we start to actually say that those brands don't matter so much and that education content is more open and we can actually have different ways of earning it and accessing it, what does that mean for the future of actually where all this stuff goes, from then on in terms of education into the workplace and so on and so on?
Do you think there's a potential with Web3? You mentioned like those stages of education throughout our lives. The thing that has frustrated me the most is, when do I actually get the possibility to truly learn? Because you go in at a young age, and then through your primary and secondary, you're always scared to be the kid that doesn't know the answer. And so you're sort of prepping at home to know the answer when you get into the classroom. University felt very much the same. I did both university in a French system, and I did it in a Belgium system, and I did it in the UK system. And the UK system was a little bit more different and open to let's learn together. But you're still expected to learn. And then you get your first job and you think you got your first job because you have the answers to all of these things, which I wish people would tell you. I'm not hiring you because you have the answers, but precisely because, you have a background and you can learn. But that's been my frustration of, when do we actually get comfortable being able to just sit and learn, basically what I'm doing with you today. So I'm just curious if you see a potential with Web3 to maybe shift that narrative a little bit of, when can you learn? When are those opportunities coming up? And that idea that we're constantly always learning, and that's a good thing.
I think, I didn't go to university. So I basically decided to go and sit on a beach in Greece and not get my any A levels. And that was my rebellious type of thing. But, back then I was essentially told that I'd screwed up my entire future. And that because I didn't get the A levels, I couldn't then go through the UCAS system, which is the UK,
Yeah.
university system. Then I couldn't get into a red brick university. I couldn't get the right degree. If I didn't have the right degree, I couldn't get the right job. But to be totally honest, at the age of 17, 18, I just was done with education at that point in my life. I didn't know what I wanted to do. How am I supposed to know at 18 what degree I want to do, which is then
Hmm.
going to do the rest of my life? And I just wasn't ready. And I think about that a lot because obviously I've not done too badly without all of that stuff. But now I think, I would like to learn. Maybe if I went back to university, I might do something like, world history or psychology or something along those lines, more of an interest based subject. But we are told that we have to pack all of our learning into that kind of official time frame. And then we're spat out into the world and
That's
we,
it.
good luck choosing a career. And then when you've chosen one, you kind of got to stick with it because otherwise, what's the value of accruing all of those years of knowledge over time? But I think, as you said, we need to get into this mindset of actually learning as a lifelong endeavor. And it's a lifelong experience to kind of go in and out of just sort of different learning mechanics and different dynamics and different categories that you might want to dive into. So I think with Web3, what's interesting, especially with tokenization and NFTs,
Mm.
is I'm thinking about NFTs and tokens as almost passport stamps. So basically, whenever you kind of turn up to a community and you contribute, you get a passport stamp. If you actually contribute financially in some way, you get a passport stamp. Maybe if you learn a new skill, you get a passport stamp. So why can't we apply that to the way we actually approach lifelong learning on a Web3 environment? So every single time you do a virtual course or every single time you spend time in a community where maybe you're absorbing new skill sets or knowledge, you get your passport stamp. And that becomes almost a way for people to read your educational history as opposed to your GCSEs, your A levels, and your college degrees.
I love this so much. And I think it ties back to your description, which I very much am in line with, of just like this multifaceted being, that you might not like the 7 curriculums that you need to study to be able to get that degree. You might be spectacular at 3 or 4 of those, but you might want to pluck a couple other pieces left, right, and center. I don't know if this is just me, or I don't know if this is just, I think, true for everyone, but I feel like we are being more multiverse and we are being more multifaceted than just being a doctor or a journalist. And I look at the career I've had, and I've jumped from a myriad of different spaces that if you look at it standing back, this makes no sense, your trajectory, but it does actually, because all of these pieces are intertwined and everything that we're learning is at the intersection of 2 or 3 different things, which I think is really exciting to think about. What is it about Web3 specifically that's going to help? So you've mentioned a couple of things here. Is it also this idea? So you've mentioned like the more personalization piece, which I think is
Mm,
key. You've touched upon a little bit like the potential of having more control. And maybe
mm.
there's this other aspect of the more immersive experience. Is there anything else that makes Web3 this real opportunity to make education that much better and smarter and more adapted to today's society?
I think there are lots of different avenues. I think the two that I would probably touch on is the financials,
Yeah.
and then also this idea of kind of portfolio education. So I think from a financial standpoint, one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is this concept of DAOs. So being able to actually pool your funds with other people and then figure out collectively how you want to spend those funds in terms of what you want to do next and where you want to invest in as a group. And I think we're starting to see that in education as well. So again, rather than these exclusive, you have to part with $500,000 over the course of your child's lifetime to send them to a college like Harvard. Instead, you've got people pooling the funds that they have available to them, which might be slightly different, into an educational DAO, for example, and then that DAO invests collectively and actually therefore has access to better educational content, but then it benefits every single member of the DAO. So it's almost like a kind of Kickstarter meets co-op, but for education purposes, which again starts to democratize the access to educational content. It starts to open it up to new people that potentially would never have been able to get through the door previously. And that to me is really, really interesting. And then I think it's this idea of portfolio. So again, when we're younger, we're told that we need to get as on the right career track as quickly as possible. So what GCSEs do you want to do when you're 15 that are then going to lead you to the right A level so that you can get into medical school, so that you can spend 7 years of your life studying this and then maybe get spat out at the end and work in the NHS for, fuck all money basically and no
Mm.
sleep. And you have to plan that from when you're, 14, 15 years old, which is insane to me. So I like this idea of the passport stamps and actually say, well, why can't you collect a portfolio set of different skill sets over the course of your lifetime, which are complementary to one another, but actually turn you more into, a multifaceted, skill set type of person. And there's a fantastic book, if you haven't read it, called Range by David Epstein, which talks about the importance of variety, in the way that you actually cultivate your skill sets over the course of your lifetime. And one of the case studies that he points to is the people who have won Nobel Prizes. And the people that have won Nobel Prizes are never purely like specific and specialist in their area. So someone, for example, who won a Nobel Prize for biology might also be an author of fiction books, or someone who won it for, I don't know, physics and astrophysics or something along those lines might also be a music composer. And he started to actually deep dive into that, and he saw that the people who had the most multifaceted skills were being forced to use different aspects of their brain, but also forced to make connections that nobody else would make between completely different categories. Whereas if you're all in on one and you follow one trajectory and you get stuck down one niche for your entirety of your career, your creativity and your muscle for your creativity diminishes. And so again, I think this idea of opening up the potential for portfolio careers using blockchain and actually starting to really kind of push the every sort of interaction or contribution or something that you make adds to your passport stamps. And then you become a much more rounded and valuable person over time. And that's trackable. It's something that other prospective, employers or DAOs or whoever it is that you work with, they can start to see that and value that in you.
Zoe, you've just made like the best case for this specific podcast of just like, this is what I wanted. I didn't want to talk with people who were lived and breathed crypto and Web3 every day. I wanted to talk with people who were sitting at the intersection of technology and entertainment, of education and entertainment, healthcare, and all because you get, to your point, you get so much more knowledge and exciting and different perspectives and really interesting ways of looking at things. Zoe, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your knowledge and sharing a little bit with us about where your head is at when it comes to education and the potential with Web3. I appreciate you spending the time with me today.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you for sticking around to the end, and I hope you enjoyed today's guests as much as I did. If you've got big crypto questions, send them our way and we'll attempt to get them answered for you. And for the more seasoned crypto investors and enthusiasts, do go check out our weekly podcast, The Unstoppable Podcast, to learn more about the latest innovations in Web3, NFTs, and the decentralized web.